But I think you got a great program tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. Bob Hennessy is going to give our talk tonight. I met Bob 3 or 4 months ago. He is a member of the Tennessee Valley Area Civil Roundtable over in Huntsville, which I'm also a member of. And I talked to him, and we were talking about programs. Bob grew up in Virginia, and he was a member of what they call the Stuart Mosby Society, if I'm correct. And so in the part of Virginia that he grew up in Northern Virginia, John Singleton Mosby to them is kind of like Nathan Bedford Forrest is to us. Everybody really likes to hear about him, and probably a lot of people down here don't know that much about Mosby. And so I think after we get through with the meeting tonight, you'll find out we probably know a little more than we did before. I did want to make one announcement. I don't know if y'all read or not, but y'all know Kitty and Victor Cox that remembers. Victor passed away yesterday, I understand. And I was sorry to hear about that, and I just learned about it today myself. And so our condolences and prayers go with Kitty and their family. And but I did want to let everybody know about that. So anyway, without any further ado, Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, fine. Is the lighting good for everybody?
Everybody say okay?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm Bob Hennessy, has been introduced. If I'm not talking loud enough, raise your hand, say something, or I generally am told to hold it down when, and I might be taking that too seriously. There was a television show, I don't know, some of you are probably old enough to remember, called The Gray Ghost.
Oh, yeah.
Around 1959, 1960, somewhere like that. And it was based on Mosby. Of course, the actor is tall and handsome and like the real Mosby. But I just want to, so you won't have to hear my voice all the time, I'm going to show you a little sample of this and see if this gets started.
We took our men from Texas, Kentucky, and Virginia, the mountains and the backwoods of the plain. We put them under order, guerrilla fighting order. And what we lacked in numbers, we made up in speed and brain. Both Rebs and Yankee strangers, they called us Mosby's Rangers. North and South, they knew our fame. Gray Ghost is what they called me. John Mosby is my name.
That's enough.
Does anybody remember that TV show?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll admit to being that old.
Give you some trivia on that if you didn't know. The guy that played Mosby, Todd Andrews, was from New York. The other one, do you remember the kind of bumbling officer that played, who was the
guy
Jeff
was
Stewart?
Yeah, it was clean shaven Jeff Stewart.
Well, yeah, but his adjutant, Harris Von Borky, the guy that played Von Bork, is the same actor that later on played Sergeant Schultz in Hogan's Heroes.
I didn't know that.
John Banner, yeah.
I'm reading Von Bork's book right now.
Yeah.
So enough of that. Okay, well this is a picture of the real Mosby, and unlike the actor, and we'll go on to the next one. And
Does he have red hair?
Do you have red hair?
I think it was sandy hair.
Okay.
It was
Couldn't tell
described.
from
Of
here.
course, the pictures back at the time weren't colorized, so I don't know how accurate that was. Here's some of his accomplishments. He was a guerrilla fighter. They had a greenback raid where basically it wasn't the plan, but they came across a Union payroll for $173,000, which was a lot of money back then. Berryville, Virginia, they robbed a wagon, got all sorts of horses, money, whiskey, cigars, food, and all this stuff. And they captured and disrupted Union supplies generally, and captured General Stoughton Did anyone knows how to pronounce that? Is it
Stoughton.
Stoughton or so?
Stoughton.
I always heard Stoughton.
Stoughton, okay. I've heard it both ways and I didn't know. But basically, his big accomplishment, he didn't have a lot of men. Probably the most he had were 300 at one time. Most of the time, he only had about 25 men. But he caused the Union Army to tie up an amazing amount of resources to protect what's called Mosby's Confederacy, the Virginia counties around Washington, from him. And he was, and I chose him because he's a very unlikely hero. He was not a big man. He had no military background. He was a lawyer by trade. He'd been sickly as a kid. He was kicked out of college. He spent a year in jail. Not what you'd look like first in his class at West Point. And he opposed secession and slavery. And here's a picture of him as a college student at the University of Virginia. And this tells the story how he became a lawyer. And basically this tells it, but he, a bully, and of course he was a little man. He was about 5'8", which isn't particularly small, but he was only about 125 pounds. And this guy who had beaten up somebody very severely picked on him and called him out, and he said, well, come see me in his dorm or where he was living. So the guy showed up, and he went to grab Mosby, and Mosby shot him. And so they kicked him out of college, and they had a trial. Apparently this bully's family had money, and so they prosecuted him, although it seemed like it was a pretty lame charge. And the guy lived, fortunately, or else they'd have prosecuted him for murder. Mm-hmm. While the prosecutor, a guy named Robertson, came to jail to visit somebody else, and Mosby spoke to him, they struck up a friendship. And he said, I'm bored here, I don't have anything to do, you got any law books so I can read? So he bought him some law books, or the conversation went something like that. And you know, of course, really the community and everybody that knew anything was saying, you know, this boy shouldn't have been put in jail in the first place. So they got him out. He let Mosby come to his office, go through his law books, and Mosby passed the Virginia bar. And he got married and had a couple of children by the time the Civil War started. I think he was about 26 years old. And here's his home in Warrenton, Virginia. This was his home when he was married, right before the war and a little bit afterwards. And I got a kick out of this because I belonged to an Army Reserve unit at Fort Belvoir, and it was called the Mosby Reserve Center. And so I thought, oh gee, that's the Gray Ghost from television. I didn't know that much about him. And I joined this Mosby Society, read books on him, and I had one of my mom's cousins was in town. I was about 30 then, and she had been a fox hunter and knew all these high society people in Northern Virginia. And so she went to visit, and there was an old man and his wife, and they had the house that was next door to them. And I kept looking out the window, and I said, that house looks familiar for some reason. And he said, have you read any history books? He said, yes. He says, that's Mosby's house. And later it was a museum. It may or not be anymore. And here's a picture of him during the war. He enlisted as a private in the Washington Rifles. He was from the western part of Virginia, a town called Abington. He was offered a commission because he was a bright guy, but he refused it. He said, I've got no military background. I can shoot and I can ride horses, but I'm not a soldier. The unit he was in was under a gentleman they called Grumble Jones. He was a captain then. He rose to general. His real name was William. And Mosby thought a lot of him. He learned a lot from him. That unit was under Jeb Stuart, and they fought at Bull Run, or Manassas, the first battle. Stuart used him as a scout. He was captured. One of his assignments, and I think he'd already made officer by then, Stuart, about a year or so into the war, had him take a message and give a book to Stonewall Jackson. So en route, he took a nap. The guy with him said, hey, the Yankees are coming. They took off, the horse threw him, and he got pinned under the horse, and the Yankees caught him. And he was exchanged as a prisoner. And whatever message that he was taking to Jackson must not have been too important, or these guys didn't pay attention to it. They gleaned nothing of it. But Lee was gearing up, thinking the Union was going to attack around the peninsula area, or come up James River. And Mosby told him, he said, no, these troops are coming up from North Carolina to Northern Virginia. And so it really helped him prepare for the Second Battle of Bull Run. And a little aside on this, I don't want to keep you too long, but if you've ever been in the military, this sounds absolutely ridiculous, but somewhere early in the war, the Confederate government came up with an idea that the men would elect their own officers. So it became a popularity contest. And so Grumble Jones, who wasn't very personal, was replaced by Fitzhugh Lee, who Mosby didn't get along with, and he didn't like Mosby either. But and Jeb Stuart, I've read a lot about. He was a good officer, but for popularity, he had Von Bork, who put on plays for him. He had a fiddler, he had a guitar players. They put on plays and stuff that I couldn't imagine an Army officer do today. They didn't make themselves popular with me when I was in the Army. So anyhow, if you capture somebody, don't brag to them about what you're going to do. And here's his heroes, Jeb Stuart. He was a big mentor. Stuart was credited with riding around McClellan's army, and actually Mosby did that first as a scout. He said, "Hey, these guys are open on one side. Let's take a look and see." And he promoted Mosby several times. He made it to major under him. And then he went to Stuart and he said, "I'd like to have an independent command." He said, "I'd like to do some guerrilla fighting right around my home area." Patterned himself after the Swamp Fox Francis Marion, the Revolutionary War. My hometown's named after. And Stuart approved this, and he successfully gathered intelligence and disrupted Union operations. And I'm going to botch this quote up. I brought it on notes, but I don't have my glasses on to read. But he told Stuart, he said, "Look, the Union Army is only as strong as their weakest link. If I can find that weak link, they're going to have to fortify everything else to protect themselves for me and tie up a lot of resources." And that's what happened.
That was his idea?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he approached Stuart with it. And here's some of his men again. This is like his early corps, and he's the little guy in the middle. He keeps referring to him as a little guy, but back then I'm 6'3", but my great-grandfather was in that war, probably wasn't much bigger than that. Yeah. He was a very slightly built man. And he became officially a partisan ranger. Stuart and Lee were both against this. They looked at guerrillas as pirates. The Union had them too. And it would be really hard, who would want to be in the regular army and get paid $60 a month or whatever they paid them when you can go out and pillage and grab a Union payroll, rob their whiskey and all this stuff, take horses. And so they were quite against that. But Mosby apparently was a man of very high ethics and didn't take a lot of that. He left it to his men. I think he got a horse out of it. Let's see, but this was guerrilla fighting. Partisan Ranger Act, it didn't save all his men, but this gave you some kind of cover. As a guerrilla, you could be treated as a spy. And so they were not supposed to execute spies, and he was one of the few units that were. Other guerrilla fighters, I can't think of the guy's name on the Union side that hit around western North Carolina, but Jesse James, Cantrell, these were not
Bill Anderson.
Bloody Bill. This is not people you want to represent your military. He captured General Stoughton in March 1863. He took 29 men with him into Fairfax, Virginia. It was called Fairfax Courthouse at the time. It was a midnight raid like so many of his raids. And he escaped with Stoughton. And the way they went in, there were plenty of Union soldiers in Fairfax. But Stoughton wanted to be by himself. And so he had his XO or aide in the downstairs, and he was upstairs. And he was, actually Mosby was not looking for him. He was looking for his original antagonist, a guy named Percy Wyndham.
Yep.
But he got what he could get, and he just knocked on they knocked on the door. He had, he did very well. People liked him, so he had the intelligence in the area. And they said, "Who is it?" It says, "New York Cavalry." "Oh, come on in." So they pulled guns on this guy and said, "Take us up to the general." So they went up, and if you're probably familiar with the story, it's one of my favorite ones. He goes up, and he couldn't wake him up. He had an empty bottle of wine or champagne next to the bed, and so he pulls his nightshirt up and slaps him on the bottom like you would a kid. The guy said, "What's the meaning of this?" And he said, "Have you heard of Mosby?" He says, "Yes, did you catch him?" And he says, "No, he caught you." So to even a little bit off of that, he was under Fitzhugh Lee then, or had to report to him, and although it was an independent command, he reported back, took Staunton. Lee had nothing good to say to Mosby, but "Oh, come on in, have a drink, have a cigar," because they'd gone to West Point together or acquainted some way in the old army. Another raid he had was the Berryville, Virginia raid. This was in the western part, kind of in the foothills. Now the rebels were really losing at this point. Sheridan had just beaten Jubal Early at Cedar Mountain, and so Sheridan, like Pope and so many other Union people, were looking, let's not protect our flanks, we're moving ahead, we're not going to hold on to anything. So he thought, well, this would be of course he had good local intelligence, he knew the area, and he said, he had I believe it was called a mountain howitzer, or some type of cannon. So he had set that up on a hill, and this long wagon train came through, and there were Union troops on it, and they, this is almost, well, anyhow, I'll go ahead and tell the story. You can see what all they captured, the plunder they got, in addition to all the loot they got. But this was almost aborted. As they pulled this thing up, it struck up a hornet's nest. In Virginia, we have hornets that live in the ground, and they're not any meaner and don't sting any worse than the ones here, but it got the horses and the cannon crew all messed up, and they actually hit one of the lead horses, knocked his head off, and because of Mosby's reputation, a lot of people that probably could have put up a good fight ran away, and they were captured all this stuff. Again, I'm well into this. If you have any questions to this point, I want to stop me, or please do. And the Greenback raid was another one. This was just a train. They derailed a train near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. They found a Union payroll of $173,000 in it. And there were a bunch of Germans on there that were immigrants coming in there, and his men complained to him and says, "They won't leave the train, we want to." So Mosby said, "Go set the car on fire." And maybe they'll understand that.
Yeah.
That's what they did. One of the Germans was a big fellow like me. He was dressed very well. He had a hat. He was a military man. He was in the Union Army. And so Mosby took him aside and said, "Why did you come here to fight us? We haven't done anything to you." And the guy in his thick Prussian accent told him, "I came here to learn the art of war and to be a soldier." And so about 30 minutes later, an hour later, the rebels are getting ready to leave, and this guy comes running up to Mosby. He's not wearing his nice boots anymore. He's not wearing his nice coat anymore. He doesn't have his nice hat anymore. "You're being stolen my clothes. Give them back." And Mosby, said, "What did you tell me you came here to do?" He says, "I learned here to learn the art of war." He says, "You're learning."
You're learning it.
So this is another. He was nearly captured several times. I think he was injured 7 times during the war, shot at least twice, nearly fatally on one of them. He was in Warrenton, Virginia, getting a haircut and a shave, and Union troops came in looking for rebels, and of course he's got smock over him and shaving cream all over his face, and a pistol in his hand like Josie Wales, and they didn't, or the other Clint Eastwood movie, and they didn't recognize him and went on. Another time he was late in the war, I think it was 1864, one of his men, there was a marriage in this guy's family, they went out to their home, and afterwards the family invited him in for dinner, so he just had his staff with him. And the Union troops, I think it was Vermont, I might be mistaken, rode up. And without even attacking, knowing they were rebels or anything, somebody shot through the window and he hit Mosby in the stomach. And he, his host and all who were friendly, his men scattered. They may have caught some of them, and he took off his, uniform coat so they wouldn't see his rank, because they had a bounty. There was a bounty on his head, and he got some of the blood from his stomach put in his mouth, so it looked like he was spitting up blood if they was examined. So the Union came in and looked at, said, well, you got a man in that room, let's go check on him, and saw this guy's not gonna make it.
Yeah.
They left and he made it. And then the more interesting time, this is the Hathaway house. They were friends of his family. His wife visited him several times during the war, and Union troops came up. They heard a rumor that he was in there. They went in, they found Mrs. Mosby upstairs. They found a horse. It didn't belong to the owner. They looked and they looked and they looked and they gave up. Of course, this is, late at night. And there was a limb on this tree that came up close to that window. And he was out there in his night clothes.
Hanging on the limb.
Climbing on a limb. And, so he had several close getaways. And he disbanded the unit in April 1865 after Lee had surrendered. And he was negotiating a surrender with the Union authorities, but after Lincoln was assassinated, the climate changed. He was afraid they would be treated as criminals or hung, so he refused to surrender. He just disbanded his men, told them all to go their separate way. He hid in Lynchburg, Virginia, and was later paroled by Grant. Now, he made himself very unpopular after the war. That's another story, but he became friends with Grant, who actually had a price on his head during the war. And here's a picture of him as an older man. He campaigned for Grant as a Republican. This made him very unpopular in Virginia. His rationale was that the Democrats weren't going to get anything done because they weren't going to get elected there. And he went from being a hero of Northern Virginia, where they hated him worse than the Yankees. So he got several jobs in civil service type jobs. The most interesting one was probably he was consul, which is like the ambassador to Hong Kong, where he did some muckraking and got rid of people. I think that was under Rutherford B. Hayes, another Civil War veteran on the other side. But the story is that he went in to see Grant, who he campaigned for, and asked him to come see me if you want a job. And so he went to see Grant. Grant's in the White House office, and he said, it said, when I first came to Virginia, it said a bunch of rebel cavalry were chasing the train I was on, and they didn't catch it. The people said that was Mosby's men. And so I wondered what would have happened if you'd caught me back then. He said, you'd be asking me for a job, and I'd be sitting in that chair. So, but I could go into length, but I think I'm just going to move on, and if there's any questions, you seem to know enough about me. I don't want to make this to where people are hungry or need bathroom breaks, etc. I've endured too many long speeches myself. Here's this grave in Warrenton, Virginia, and that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please shoot.